Before Moses received the law on Sinai. Before the Buddha sat beneath the Bodhi tree. Before Confucius walked the roads of ancient China. Before the prophets of Israel, before the philosophers of Greece, before every spiritual and intellectual revolution that shaped the ancient world into what it became, there was a voice in the Iranian plateau crying out into the vast prehistoric darkness with questions so fundamental and answers so revolutionary that they quietly changed the architecture of human thought forever. His name was Zarathustra. The Greeks called him Zoroaster. He was a priest, a poet, a prophet, and a reformer, a man who looked at the religious world of ancient Iran and found it not merely inadequate but morally catastrophic, and who responded not with accommodation or gradual reform but with a wholesale reimagining of the relationship between the divine, the human, and the fundamental nature of the universe itself. He asked the questions that children ask and that adults learn to stop asking because no one has satisfying answers. Why is there evil in the world? If a good God made everything, why does suffering exist? Why do good people face injustice while the wicked prosper? What does the universe ultimately want from human beings? And unlike the priests and the philosophers who came before him, he did not offer comfortable answers or ritual deflections. He offered a framework so coherent, so morally serious, and so intellectually rigorous that it became the foundation on which the three great Abrahamic religions, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, would later build their own understandings of God, evil, judgment, heaven, hell, and the end of time. The story of Zarathustra is the story of the world's first great reformer. And it begins, appropriately enough, in the most ancient world imaginable, a world so old that we cannot date it with certainty, so distant that the landscape it happened in is reconstructed from linguistic analysis and archaeological inference rather than written record, so foundational that its consequences are still shaping your moral vocabulary right now, whether you know it or not. The dates of Zarathustra's life are one of the great unresolved questions of religious history. Ancient Greek sources placed him 6,000 years before Plato, an impossibility by any modern reckoning that reflects more about how ancient peoples measured the distance of legend than about actual chronology. More recent scholarly analysis, working from linguistic analysis of the Gathas, the 17 hymns that are the only texts universally attributed to Zarathustra himself, and from comparison with the Vedic Sanskrit of the Indian subcontinent, suggests a date somewhere between 1500 and 1000 BCE, with some scholars arguing for an even earlier period. The traditional Zoroastrian dating places him around 600 BCE. The honest answer is that we do not know precisely, and that the uncertainty is itself part of how ancient and how foundational this story is. What we can reconstruct with reasonable confidence is the world he was born into. The Bronze Age Iranian plateau, the vast elevated landmass between Mesopotamia to the west and the Indian subcontinent to the east, was populated by Indo-Iranian peoples who shared a religious world with their Vedic cousins across the Hindu Kush mountains. This Proto-Indo-Iranian religion was polytheistic, nature-worshipping, and centered on a priestly class, the Magi in the Iranian tradition, who performed elaborate rituals involving fire, the ritual drink haumar, and the sacrifice of animals to a pantheon of divine beings. The social world was tribal, pastoral, organized around cattle herding, and frequently violent. Cattle raiding was both an economic practice and a form of warfare, and the nomadic warrior culture it sustained was brutal in its treatment of the settled agricultural communities that the raiders preyed upon. Zarathustra was born into this priestly class, a member of the Spitama clan, his full name Zarathustra Spitama. His father was Purushaspa and his mother was Dugdova, and the tradition preserves stories about his birth that carry the specific quality of sacred biography. Miraculous signs, divine intervention, the foreknowledge of cosmic enemies who tried to destroy the child before he could fulfill his destiny. In the Zoroastrian hagiography, the divine light of Zarathustra's soul was so evident from the moment of his birth that he did not cry as other children cry, he laughed. And the forces of evil knew immediately that a great threat to their power had entered the world. He grew up in the priestly tradition, learning the rituals, the hymns, the priestly knowledge that constituted the religious world of his people. The tradition says he showed extraordinary wisdom and moral seriousness from his earliest years, asking questions about justice and suffering that his teachers could not answer, giving away his own possessions to the poor with a generosity that was already an implicit critique of the priestly establishment's relationship with wealth and ritual. At 15 he was invested as a priest. By 20 he was already distinguished within his tradition. And something in him was already restless, already dissatisfied with what the tradition offered as answers to the questions that burned in him. At the traditional age of 30, the age at which priests and prophets in the ancient Near Eastern world were considered to reach the fullness of their vocation, he went to a river to draw water for the morning ritual. What happened at that river was the transforming encounter of his life and one of the most significant religious experiences in human history. In the shining brilliance of dawn, standing at the edge of the water, he saw a radiant being of light approaching him from the eastern sunrise. The being identified itself as Vohu Mana, good mind, or good purpose, one of the divine beings that Zarathustra would come to understand as the Amisha Spentas, the holy immortals who embodied the highest attributes of Ahura Mazda, the wise lord. Vohu Mana led him into the presence of Ahura Mazda, the supreme divine being whose name means Lord of Wisdom, and of 5 other radiant beings. In that encounter Zarathustra received the revelation that would become Zoroastrianism. The universe was not a polytheistic playground of competing divine forces. It was the arena of a cosmic struggle between 2 fundamental principles, Ahura Mazda, the supreme good and wise lord who had created the world in truth and light, and Angra Mainyu, the destructive spirit, the embodiment of evil and darkness who had chosen opposition to the good from the beginning of existence. Everything in the universe was aligned with one or the other of these principles. And human beings, uniquely among all created things, had been given the freedom to choose which side they stood on. This was the revolution. Not just a theological innovation but a moral earthquake. In the religious world Zarathustra was born into, the gods were morally ambiguous, capable of both good and harm, requiring to be placated rather than followed, demanding ritual rather than ethical commitment. Zarathustra swept all of that away. Ahura Mazda was not morally ambiguous. He was the source and the embodiment of truth, righteousness, and goodness, Asha, the cosmic principle of truth and order that was the foundation of all that was good and all that was right. Angra Mainyu was not a rival god to be propitiated, he was the principle of the lie, drudge, the cosmic force of deceit and destruction that stood in total opposition to everything Ahura Mazda was and wanted. And in that framework, every human life was a moral battleground. Every thought, every word, every action aligned you either with truth or with the lie. With creation or with destruction. With Ahura Mazda or with Angra Mainyu. There was no neutral position. There was no ritual shortcut. There was no sacrifice of animals that substituted for the daily, moment by moment, thought by thought, choice by choice commitment to truth and righteousness and good action that Zarathustra said was what Ahura Mazda actually wanted from human beings. The Gathas, the 17 hymns in the ancient Avestan language that Zarathustra composed and that are the direct record of his religious experience and his moral teaching, are among the oldest religious poetry in human history. They are also among the most personally immediate. They are not abstract theology. They are the prayers and the questionings and the declarations of a specific man wrestling with the hardest questions in real time, asking Ahura Mazda directly for wisdom, for strength, for understanding, for the power to do what is right and to help his people do the same. They have a quality of rawness, of genuine personal encounter, that sets them apart from the liturgical literature that surrounds them and marks them unmistakably as the product of direct religious experience rather than theological construction. His teaching on the 3 pillars of the good life became the moral center of Zoroastrianism, Hamata, Hukta, Huvashta. Good thoughts, good words, good deeds. Not ritual. Not sacrifice. Not the performance of elaborate ceremonies that required priestly mediation between the human and the divine. The moral life itself, the quality of what you think and what you say and what you actually do, was the religious life. The alignment of thought and word and deed with truth and goodness was both the path and the destination. He began to preach his revelation in the community where he lived. The response was almost entirely hostile. The priestly establishment, whose entire livelihood and social position depended on the rituals and the sacrifices and the religious structure that Zarathustra was dismantling, rejected him immediately and with the specific ferocity of people who understand that their world is being threatened at its foundations. The warrior class, whose cattle-raiding culture was directly condemned by Zarathustra's emphasis on the protection of cattle and the settled agricultural communities that depended on them, were equally opposed. He was mocked. He was threatened. He was driven out of his community. For 10 or 12 years he wandered, seeking a patron who would give his message a hearing, finding none, continuing to preach and to teach and to pray and to compose the hymns that preserved his revelation, sustained in his mission by a conviction that was apparently so deep and so unshakable that even years of rejection and wandering could not erode it. The experience of those years, the loneliness, the frustration, the specific suffering of someone who knows they carry something true and cannot get the world to listen, is audible in the Gathas. He asks Ahura Mazda directly, "When will the good kingdom come? When will the followers of truth be vindicated? How long must the lie prevail?" The prayers of a prophet who was not spared the human experience of doubt and weariness even in the midst of genuine religious conviction. The turning point came when he reached the court of a king named Vishtaspa, a regional ruler whose exact historical identity and location remain matters of scholarly debate, but who is identified in the tradition as the great patron whose conversion to Zarathustra's teaching gave the new religion its first political protection and its first institutional home. The conversion of Vishtaspa was not immediate or simple. The tradition describes debates at court, confrontations with the existing priests, imprisonments, and miracles, until the king and his family were finally persuaded. Once Vishtaspa converted, the situation changed entirely. The new religion had royal protection. It could organize. It could teach. It could spread. Zarathustra spent his remaining years at Vishtaspa's court, teaching, composing, organizing the community of his followers, developing the institutional forms that would carry his revelation forward after his death. He married 3 times and had children, including sons who became priests in his tradition and daughters who married into prominent families that became patrons of the new faith. He is believed to have died at approximately 77 years old. The tradition records that he was killed by a priest of the old religion while he was tending the sacred fire, a death at the altar that the tradition has always understood as martyrdom. What he left behind was a religious revolution whose consequences rippled outward in ways that he could not have imagined and that the world has not yet fully acknowledged. When the Achaemenid Persian Empire, founded by Cyrus the Great in the 6th century BCE, became the largest empire the ancient world had yet seen, it was Zoroastrian. And Cyrus the Great, the Persian king who issued the world's first known declaration of human rights, who freed the Jewish people from their Babylonian captivity and allowed them to return to Jerusalem and rebuild the temple, who is the only non-Jewish figure in the Hebrew Bible to be called Mashiach, Anointed One, was shaped by a religious and moral world that Zarathustra had created. The Jewish people's encounter with Zoroastrian Persia during the Babylonian exile is the period when scholars trace the development of specific theological concepts in Jewish thought: the concept of Satan as a personal force of evil, the idea of resurrection, the Last Judgment, the cosmic dualism of good and evil, that later became central to Christianity and Islam as well. The 3 Magi who appear in Matthew's Gospel following a star to find the infant Jesus, they were Zoroastrian priests. The tradition of Zoroastrian astronomer priests following signs of cosmic significance was real and documented. The wise men of the Nativity story were, historically, practitioners of a religious tradition that traced back to the man who had received his revelation at a riverbank on the Iranian plateau 1,000 years before. The concept of the Frasho Kareti, the renovation of the world at the end of time, when Ahura Mazda will ultimately triumph over Angra Mainyu, the dead will be resurrected, souls will be judged, evil will be destroyed, and the world will be restored to its original perfect state, is the first fully developed eschatological framework in religious history. The Last Judgment of Christianity and Islam, the Messianic era of Judaism, all of these are in theological conversation with ideas that Zarathustra articulated in the Gathas. The sacred fire, the Atash, the flame that burns in Zoroastrian fire temples without being extinguished, is the most enduring symbol of his religion and his legacy. Fire for Zarathustra was not an object of worship but a symbol of Ahura Mazda's truth and light, the visible, present, always burning sign of the divine principle that has never been extinguished and never will be. Some of the sacred fires in Zoroastrian temples in Iran and India have been burning continuously for over 1,000 years. Today approximately 150,000 Parsis, the descendants of Zoroastrians who fled the Islamic conquest of Persia and found refuge in India, keep this ancient faith alive in Mumbai and Gujarat and around the world. In Iran, a small but persistent Zoroastrian community has survived 14 centuries of pressure and continues to practice the faith of its ancestors. And everywhere in the world where people believe that good and evil are real, that human choices matter cosmically, that truth is worth telling even when lies are easier, that the light should be tended and the fire kept burning. The voice of a prophet who laughed at birth on the Iranian plateau 3,000 years ago is still speaking. Good thoughts. Good words. Good deeds. 3 words. 3,000 years. Still the most complete summary of what a human life, well lived, actually consists of. The fire has not gone out.